keep the commercial about who we are and what we do short. I want to spend time today talking through these changes to Windows 2016 and how they're going to impact organizations. But Method 180, just at a high level, is a bunch of ex-Microsoft folks. Some of us were in sales, some of us were in licensing, and we now help organizations either drive out cost of their licensing contracts with Microsoft or support them through audits or SAM engagements if they're going through those types of things with Microsoft. And so I thought today what we would do is we would go through, what do we want to get out of this webinar. Microsoft has announced, as I'm sure most of you are aware, that licensing for Windows Server, and this actually applies for System Center as well, although we're not talking about System Center, but pretty much the concepts that we're talking today will also go, be in force for Windows or for System Center as well. But they are changing from a processor licensing model to a core-based licensing model. Microsoft is stating that this is revenue neutral, which I would say, and I've got some stats I'm going to show a little later this afternoon here. But I would say for the most part, this change from core licensing to core licensing from processors is revenue neutral or is very close to it. But there has been significant price increases on Windows through the licensing changes that Microsoft has made since 2012. And so we'll go through that because I think a lot of organizations have kind of missed that change where they made the jump from server only to processor licensing in 2012, and we'll go through that. We're going to talk a little bit about the difference in the licensing rules of licensing physical servers versus virtual servers. And the reason for that is, if you're familiar, I did a webinar recently on debunking kind of SQL licensing myths, which is on our YouTube channel. If you go to YouTube and just search for Method 180, you can see that if you want to see a replay of that. But the licensing model for Windows is different than SQL, particularly in that virtual server world. And so we'll go through that a little bit today. One of the things that we're getting asked more and more in the business is, how does cloud licensing work? So if we take our workloads that are sitting on Windows and move those to a cloud service, whether that's Azure or AWS, how does that work? So we'll touch on that today. And then we're going to touch a little bit on how to build a process to validate, if you are looking at a price increase, or just how generally to do optimization of your Windows Server licensing. So we'll go through that. And we are going to touch on some of the, I'll call them basics of licensing Windows. So if you're newer to licensing, we're going to go through a little bit of the history of that. And that becomes important, particularly when you're looking at optimizing your Windows Server licensing anyways. So we'll touch a little bit on, some of the history and some of just the basic concepts of licensing. And so coming out of this, my goal is to hope that, you'll be able to take a look at your organization's use of Windows, determine if you are facing a price increase, determine, if you do have any areas where you're under or over licensed, and give you some strategies on potentially how to reset your licensing to optimize for that. Knowing when the new licensing rules will apply for you, because for some of you on this call today, that could be 3 years from now. And we're going to talk through when those changes come into effect, and different ways that you can definitely prepare for that, get you in a position where you potentially can budget for your renewals in a more effective way. And then the key concept, one of the things that Microsoft is doing, are license grants. And if any of you went through the shift from processors to cores with SQL back in 2012, you'll be familiar with the license grants, but we're going to talk through some strategies on how to optimize those license grants potentially to your benefits, right? So the first thing I want to do is I just want to touch a little bit on product use rights. And I think the reason for this is that when you're looking at licensing, I think a lot of the times one of the traps that most organizations or people fall into is they kind of say, I have an enterprise agreement with Microsoft. And because I have an EA, I buy my licenses through there, and I put a number of Windows Server licenses in this case, and I can true those up each year. And the rules of the EA are kind of what govern my use. And, that's definitely a trap, because the rules of your use of the product actually start with the product use rights and the rules associated within those product use rights. And Microsoft has changed the name of the product use rights, or their acronym PUR, P-U-R. It's now called product terms, but if you just Google Microsoft product terms or product use rights, there's a website where you can download the most current one, which I believe they update monthly, as well as all the historical product use rights are off that website as well. So that's a great resource if you happen to Google that. But I think one of the key concepts, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but I do want to just touch on this, is that you do have downgrade and upgrade rights, and then there's a concept called down addition rights. And so if you look at Windows Server today, there's really two versions of that, two editions, which are standard and data center. Standard being the lower edition, data center being the higher edition. We're not going to get into the technical nature of what's the difference between the two, but standard is a subset of data center. And so if you want to go from Windows Server 2012 to 2016, if you have active software assurance, you get that right if it's active when 2016 launches, or you buy a new license for Windows 2016. The other concept that Microsoft has is the step-up concept, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which is where if I have a Windows standard license, it has to have active SA, I can actually step that up to data center, and all I do there is I pay the delta between the difference of data center and standard. So they basically take into account that license cost for standard and just charge me the difference between the license cost for data center and the difference in the SA cost, and I can step that up. And so that's when we talk about step up, that's going from the lower edition to the higher edition. The only way you can do that is if you have active SA. But you also have what they call version downgrade rights. And so all of this becomes important when we talk about how to optimize licenses, and that's why I'm touching on this. But version downgrade rights, as most of you are aware of, is if I have a 2016 license, I can use 2012 R2 or 2012 or 2008. It allows me to go down to the older versions. And so that becomes important as we get into, that license piece, like I said. But the other piece to note is you do have what they call down addition rights. Now, sometimes you have to check the product use rights specifically because sometimes this is allowed, and in some scenarios it's not allowed. But basically what down addition rights are is in the case where I have a Windows Server data center license, I can use that license and assign that to a Windows standard use or Windows standard deployment and not have to purchase a Windows standard license. So if I had an extra data center license, I needed a net new standard, I could just apply that and use the down addition rights to do that. Now, you have to make sure that you have the right version and edition. So in other words, if I want to deploy a Windows 2016 standard server, but I only own a license only for a Windows 2012, I can't do down addition because both the versions need to match, okay? So there's just a couple of key concepts here around version upgrades. That's going from 2012 to 2016. Step up, going from the lower edition standard to data center. Downgrade rights, going from a newer version where my license allows me to install 2016, but I only want to put 2012 on. Or down edition where I use a higher edition data center to cover a lower edition standard installation, okay? So the other key concept within the product use rights that's important to note is what Microsoft calls license reassignment or the 90-day rule. So you hear them kind of talk to this in a couple of different ways, but in the product use rights, it's actually under the section for license reassignment. And really what this rule states is, and I'm going to use a very simple scenario in the Windows Server world. I have two host servers with one virtual Windows Server session on it. So I got Windows Server sitting on host 1. I got a technology like vMotion. It moves it over to host 2. The Windows moves over to host 2. The license can go with it. But what Microsoft does, and that's in that section where it says the limitations, and you see the part in the brackets within 90 days of last assignment, what they do is they say once the license has been transferred from host 1 to host 2, that the license is now to be assigned only to host 2 for 90 days. So I can't do a temporary reassignment of licenses. So if vMotion fires that server back to host 1, then the license the instance of Windows can go back, but the license is still on host 2, and I basically no longer have a license for my Windows that's sitting on host 1, and I'm kind of in a non-compliant state. So when Microsoft talks about server mobility and the 90-day rule, this is exactly what they're referring to, the ability to move a license to a new device, host 1 to host 2, but it's now assigned to host 2 for 90 days because they only allow you to transfer a license once in 90 days. Now, for some products, SQL Server, Microsoft has an SA benefit that overrides that. So with SQL Server, if you have software assurance on your SQL license, it can move as many times as you want from host 1 to host 2 without having to worry about the 90-day rule, because they have what they call server mobility rights built into SQL Server. Windows servers does not include that. They have put into it a cloud mobility rule, and so basically a cloud mobility rule is where you can take that server and move it to a third-party data center, whether that's Azure or AWS or Rackspace or one of those types of organizations, and you can move it there with some restrictions. We'll talk about that in a little bit later. But they have a cloud mobility right, but no server mobility right with Windows, and that's one of the, I guess, lovely things that makes Microsoft licensing so confusing. Is different product groups, Windows and SQL, have different rules. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about purchasing software assurance, because a lot of the times people kind of get on this train of software assurance, and we typically advocate for our clients that you should renew software assurance or when and where it makes sense. But I think what's going on in the Microsoft world is this decision is becoming a little bit more clouded based on what they're doing, but also there is a lot of opportunity, in my belief, and when you see some of the data sets that we're going to talk about here in a little bit, that there's a lot of opportunity for organizations to optimize their licenses by looking at selectively renewing software assurance. And we'll go into that in a bit here. But software assurance, as most of you are aware, that's Microsoft's maintenance program, which really the key benefit of it, for the most part, up to a few years ago, was to get the new version right. So if currently have software assurance on my Windows server, I'm entitled to 2012 R2. When they launch 2016 here in a few months, I would get 2016 as long as my software assurance is active. So that new version right is the biggest piece of the benefit. But there's also two other areas that you should look at. One is what I call product use rights embedded in software assurance. And so what Microsoft is doing and has been doing over the last few years is putting rights in software assurance that has nothing to do with that upgrade. So things like server mobility with SQL, the cloud mobility right with Windows servers and SQL for that matter, that is a software assurance benefit of the product use right. So if I want cloud mobility or I need cloud mobility, the only way I can get that is to have active SA. So you really have to look at what are the sort of product use rights that are buried in the product to determine if you need SA. And, so when you're making a decision on buying SA, do I want to get the upgrades? Does it make sense financially? Yes, I would buy SA. Are there, let's say that's no, I don't need to upgrade I don't upgrade every 4 years like SA justifies. So I want to I don't want to get SA because I'm going to upgrade every 6 years. Makes more sense just to buy license only. You would then look and see, okay, are there components of SA that are built into these product use rights that I need? Yes, then unfortunately I have to buy SA. And then there's what I call the extras. And so these are things like training vouchers and deployment planning and problem resolution support and things that Microsoft kind of throws in for free or as freebies. And, you would never make a decision to buy SA based on those things. They're kind of nice to have. I heard one client say to me the other day that it's kind of almost like the air miles or kind of loyalty plan, these little extras that you get. So, you're not going to make the decision based on them, but they're nice to have if you have them. The one thing that I will say is that Microsoft is continuing to add more and more SA benefit type rights or to the product use rights. So more and more of these things that are independent of upgrading, that are usage rights on the products, they're doing more and more of those. Constantly every quarter or so we see something new come out, for a various product that kind of falls into this category. So I wanted to talk a little bit about just Windows Server licensing in general, just to kind of set the stage, and then we'll get into some of the more in-depth conversations here. But Microsoft has made, changes in licensing to Windows since 2012, since they launched Windows Server 2012. And so, the biggest thing that they did in 2012 was they switched from server licensing to processor licensing. And I do think, and I'm going to come back to this here in a second, but I do think this is one area that was overlooked by most organizations when they made this change, because most companies were focused on the SQL processor to core transition, and this server to processor change that Microsoft made on Windows Server was overlooked for the most part. They also removed, so they used to have 3 editions, or they have more, but 3 kind of that would fit into the corporate space for the most part: Standard, Enterprise, and Data Center. They removed the Enterprise edition, kind of pushed its functionality into the licensing of Standard, so you can still install an Enterprise Server 2012, but the functionality or the licensing is covered with a Windows 2012 Standard license. They did increase the price, and they made changes in the virtualization rule. The biggest being, so if you go back prior to 2012 or 2008 versions, Windows Standard allowed 1 VM from a virtualization rule, so I could license 1 VM. Windows Enterprise allowed 4, and then Data Center allowed unlimited. So there was a change there because they got rid of the Enterprise, and what they did was they basically said Standard now can have 2 VMs, per license. Data Center still had unlimited. So there was a little bit of a change in the virtualization rule there. Now, I do want to touch on that server to processor for a moment, because what Microsoft did was, if you had a Windows server, so there was no processors associated with that in the past, and what they basically did was they said, if I now have, I'm going to give you a Windows 2012 license, and that's going to be 2 processors. And so they did do a grant, and we're going to talk about grants in this new one here in a second. They did give you a grant, but a lot of people didn't go and get grants for those servers that had 4 or 8 or 12 processors. They just kind of took the 2. And in most audits that we saw for even a few years after 2012, Microsoft wasn't really looking at that. And so I think that this is going to become a real key thing here in the future around these grants. So again, that changed server to processor, removed the Enterprise, made a few changes in the virtualization rules. When they launched 2012 R2, they did yet another price increase on the server licenses. And here's a great example of where they introduced an SA benefit, that it was a product use right one, and that was with RDS CALs. And this one is really, there's a small percentage of customers that can use it, so I kind of call this one a limited value one, but it does have some applicability. And basically what that is if you're using a third-party data center, Amazon, for instance, to host applications for you like Office, you required the hoster, Amazon in that case, would have charged you for an RDS CAL to do that, because it's being served up through terminal services. Now, if you have SA, they allow you to use those RDS CALs so that you can avoid the few dollars a month that the hoster would have charged you for that license. Okay, and so now we come to Windows Server 2016, which is getting set to launch here in a little bit. And basically, what they've done now is they've changed from a processor-based license to a core licensing model. We're going to go into that in more detail. I do put a note in here that you still need CALs. I get asked that quite a bit. Do I still need the Windows CALs? Yes. But they did make that change from processor to cores. I put a discounted Azure pricing becomes a new SA benefit. And I call it discounted. It's really not discounted. It's really that cloud mobility function, where now if I have SA, there's some restrictions. We'll talk about that again here in a little bit. But I can take my own licenses into the Azure cloud and not have to pay the monthly fee for a Windows Server license to Azure, so to speak. Okay, so that's really the net summary of the changes that they've made over the last 4 years. So now I want to talk a little bit about the 2016. What really is the nuts and bolts of the changes. So again, one of the great things about Microsoft and how they cause so much confusion is the product groups don't, control how they do their own licensing. So Windows and SQL are different here. So Windows has said that you have to have a minimum of 16 core licenses per physical server, whereas SQL it's 8. Okay, so they're basically coming and saying it's 16 cores per physical server. They basically say each physical processor has to have a minimum of 8 cores. So, you have to look at how many processors and cores, and then purchase the number of core licenses with these two rules in mind, that I have to license a processor with a minimum of 8 cores, and I have to have 16 per box. So if I have a one processor server with 4 cores, I actually still have to buy 16 cores for that. Okay, so those two minimums need to be met. Now, what they have not announced any price increases. They may not do it this time. We're getting close enough that normally you would have heard it, but they're basically saying that 16 core licenses are equivalent to the price of the 2 processor license that they have today, and that holds pat whether it's standard or data center. One of the things that is different, I put special rules apply to hardware virtualization here. One of the things that is different than SQL is that it's all about the physical cores. So it doesn't matter if hyper-threading is turned on. It doesn't matter how many virtual cores you're using. It's just take a look at the physical cores in the box, and that's how they're licensing it. And we talked about that Azure license already there for a couple of seconds. So I think it's key to note that you may need more license depending on the hardware, obviously, because it is assigned to that physical box. A couple of kind of tips and tricks that you're going to find here, which again is sort of different than what you've seen in the past from, say, SQL, is that all licenses assigned to a server must be the same edition. So you can't mix and match standard and data center on the same server. So that's kind of new. Now, probably in the past, if you were doing data center where you're putting them on the same server, it would have been virtualized, and you would have done it for the unlimited virtualization. So I think that is kind of mute, but it is important to note that you can't mix and match the editions on the same physical server. The number of core licenses, and we talked about this, but it's got to be the total number of cores on all procs. It's got to be a minimum of 16 per server, and it's got to be a minimum of 8 core licenses per processor. So, if I have a 4-processor, 4-core box, which equals 16 total cores, I actually have to license 32 in that circumstance, okay? So the core licenses are sold in 2 packs. Basically, this is just kind of list price. For standard, it's 110 per 2-pack. Data center, it's 770. But I can't just buy 2 for a server. I have to buy 16 total cores or 8 licenses. So if I just have one box that has less than 16 physical cores, I would actually buy 8 2-core packs, okay? So again, even though they're, I think, trying to, they'll tell you they're trying to simplify, you can see how this is getting confusing already. I got to buy 8 licenses for a single server. Now, what they'll tell you is they've sold them in 2-core packs so that if you had, you needed just an extra 4 cores, you only had to buy, 2 licenses more, or 4 cores, versus purchasing if they sold these in 16-core licenses. So I guess in that way they are doing something that helps clients, but it is 2-core packs, and so each server is going to have a minimum of 8 licenses assigned to it. Okay. Another difference between Windows and SQL is there's no core factor. So those of you that are familiar with SQL Server licensing, Microsoft, depending on the processor type, does have a core factor with, for instance, some of the AMD chips get a 0.75 core factor, so you actually have to purchase fewer licenses. Windows did not choose to provide a core factor, so all processors, regardless of type, are created equal in their minds, so there's no core factor here. Obviously, it's pretty simple math. Any server that has more than 8 cores per processor is going to see a price increase. Now, those are pretty big boxes, and we'll see. This is why I was saying I don't think that this price increase is all that significant on the core licenses, but there's definitely one there. But I think it's important to review your architecture moving forward, and this is just for both Windows and SQL. As you're looking at doing consolidation, you're looking at bringing in net new servers, or you're looking at virtualizing more, you really want to be taking a look at your architecture moving forward and see if you can purchase things like more RAM before you buy more processors or cores. Now, I say that when I talk about the tips here in a few seconds on getting grants, we might have a different idea here, but you really want to be looking at these things, because as you bring in more cores, your cost is just going to increase and increase and increase. And so it's very important to kind of take a look at what I can do to get better performance that doesn't necessarily equate to me adding more cores into a box moving forward. So this is probably a little bit of a, technology 101, but I just wanted to talk about a concept that gets people confused when it comes to virtualization, because those rules that we just talked about were really just physical servers, right? That's how the licensing works on the physical box. In a virtual world, hypervisor in the Microsoft world, that doesn't matter. That doesn't matter what you're using there, whether that's ESX from VMware, or whether that's Hyper-V, or whether it's Zen or whatnot. A hypervisor is a hypervisor. But basically, the concept that most people get a little confused on is Microsoft likes to use this thing called an operating system environment, or an OSE. So they use that terminology quite often, and that's just really a virtual session. So whether that's the operating system, Windows Server, which most people would call that a VM, a virtual machine, a VM, a Windows Server. Just change VM to OSE, and they call it an OSE. They do the same with SQL. So if you got a virtualized SQL, they call that a SQL OSE, and they kind of use virtual machine and OSE intermingled. But so if you do hear them use that term operating system environment, or OSE, that just means that it's a virtual instance of that operating system, okay? Now, one of the things that I should note, and I'm just drawing a complete and utter blank on the name of the technology, but they are launching a new technology with Windows 2016 where you can basically have a VM inside of a VM, and I think they call that nested virtualization. That's the term they use, sorry. So if you have a VM inside a VM, that's considered to be two VMs or two OSEs. So when it comes to licensing, just think of those as two separate OSEs, even though it's kind of a VM inside of a VM, so to speak, with this nested technology that they're launching. So the virtualization rules haven't really changed in 2016. So basically, if you have a standard edition, you can have one physical OSE. So if you're using Hyper-V, for instance, you can have that installed on the physical box, using Hyper-V as your virtualization layer or your hypervisor, and you get to cover two virtual OSEs with that standard license. Data Center allows for unlimited VMs. Now, a difference between SQL and Windows, again, I know I keep coming back to that, but these are important things to point out because a lot of the times I find people confuse SQL licensing rules with Windows licensing rules, and because they're not the same, I think that's the point I really want to get across is unlimited virtualization with Windows Server does not require SA, whereas SQL it does. Okay, so if you want unlimited virtualization with Data Center, you don't need to have software assurance in order to get that. Okay, we talked about the license reassignment rule, where the 90-day rule, and I did get asked the question, I think, from Dennis here. So Dennis, I'll just answer your question now. With Data Center, Dennis was asking if he has to be concerned with the product use rights for server mobility if he has or uses all Data Center licenses. And so the short answer is no, because if you have both of those hosts, where I was talking about moving from host 1 to host 2, if both of those were licensed with Data Center, both of those physical boxes are licensed for unlimited virtualization. So as long as all your host servers are licensed with Data Center, then you don't have to worry about that server mobility rule, because basically the ability to have unlimited VMs or OSEs on those servers is basically going to make that a mute rule. So in that case, if you are using Data Center across the board for those servers, then you don't have to worry about the 90-day rule because they're covered for unlimited number of VMs per host anyways, okay? So one of the concepts that works a lot with SQL, and it used to work with Windows as well, is a concept called stacking. So if you ever hear Microsoft or anybody referring to stacking licenses, what that really means is you can stack multiple standard licenses to have more than those two virtual OSEs that come per license. So if I got a host server that has 4 VMs on it, I could put 2 standard licenses to get 4 virtual sessions licensed, and you're allowed to do that. So you are allowed to stack. Where it becomes difficult is in an audit. If you're doing stacking and vMotion and the 90-day rule comes into play, it's very difficult to prove in an audit where and when those things are moving. So if you've got infinity rules on that server to lock it down, that's an easy way to show Microsoft that, it hasn't moved. We don't have to worry about it. It's locked down to that host, and we can use these two. And we do see scenarios where this makes sense quite often. You got a branch, regional office where you're virtualizing a couple of different, file and print and a couple of different things in the branch, but you don't want to be bringing them back into the main data center for those local services. So you throw a box out, you virtualize it, you put 2 or 3 Windows sessions on it, but they don't ever move. They're not in a cluster or anything like that. So there are scenarios where stacking financially makes sense, but you want to be able to prove that. And so in an audit, basically they'll basically say you have to prove to us that these things aren't moving. And so one way is to show them the infinity rules on the server that they don't move. Another way is if you are using VMware, your vCenters, you can run a report with a product called RV Tools. And if you've got questions on that, feel free to send me an email. We can send you data on our details on how to use RV Tools. But RV Tools will go out and take a look at all the hosts inside of the vCenter and the VMs themselves and tell you what host they resided on and how many times they've moved in a 90-day period and stuff. So you can document it. It's just a little bit difficult to do. And back to the question that I was asked, data center is easier to maintain compliance because I don't have to worry about the 90-day rule because I'm licensing to the maximum number of unlimited VMs. If I am doing stacking, really what you want to do is take a look at a host, license it for the maximum number of VMs it's ever going to have on it, and that's how you kind of prove that out, if it makes sense. Okay. I'm probably going to. I'll just touch briefly on this slide because sometimes people ask me what are the different licenses that I can use and when should I use those and how does that work. The key point that I want to make in here is just around dev and test in UAT environments. The MSDN licenses are very cost-effective for your test, dev, and UAT. Most organizations are using those licenses now for those pre-production servers, but every now and again I am still seeing clients that don't. They may think it's difficult to track who has access to the test servers and things like that or just weren't aware of it, but I think that's just the key point I wanted to make here. So I want to talk about the core license grants. So basically what Microsoft is going to do for every Windows server that you have, one license, which is 2 processors today, they are going to grant you, if you have active SA, when they launch this, they will give you 16 cores of that version. So in other words, if I have a standard license, I'm going to get if I have a standard license, I'm going to get 16 cores of standard. If I have a data center license, I'm going to get 16 cores of data center. So you can get greater than the 8-core per processor that they would grant you, but to do that, you have to actually document it. And so to document it, you're going to have to go out and inventory your servers and take a look at the physical hardware details. And so Microsoft uses a tool called MAP, the Microsoft Assessment and Planning Toolkit. They love this tool. It's one that they've created. It does an okay job. There are some challenges with it, but it does do an okay job. And so basically what you need to do is you need to go out and scan your environment, and then you would have to provide those details to Microsoft of the number of current processors and the number of cores per processor. So if you do have one of those higher density core servers where maybe there's 16 cores per processor, this is how you would go out and get grants for those for the extra 8 cores on that processor, okay? So in order to get the grants, if you want more than the 8, so if you don't do anything, you're just going to get 8. And so when we talk about what happened in 2012, everybody just got 2. Not too many people that I know of. We did work with a number of clients and did get them more. But if you had a 4-processor box, most likely my guess is you were only granted two licenses for that. So and I'm going to talk about software assurance here in a second and whether you can do this without renewing, because that's one of the questions I get asked. But a couple of tricks that you may want to consider to put yourself in a better position when it comes to these grants. So one of the things you may want to consider doing is truing up more 2012 licenses before your EA expires. So if you are in an EA and you haven't hit your final year yet, you may want to do some more true-ups, and you can run the math to figure out, does that make sense from a pricing perspective, right? Does it make sense to do a true-up versus, do a net new license buy in the future and things like that? Because to do a true-up, you don't even have to have physical hardware today. So basically, if you think about it, I know that I'm going to have a couple of net new big boxes come in because we got this big project. If I true up now, I'm just going to get the grants and I can cover off those new boxes, or I can buy some true-up licenses because I know that I got a physical box that only has 2 processors in it. We're going to put 2 more into it, and we can go from there. So there are a couple of different reasons why you would do that. One of the key ones is that you only pay 12.5% for SA in that final year versus 25%. So this works especially if you don't want to renew SA. You may want to upgrade your hardware if you know you're going to do that prior to your SA expiring. So if that example where I said you're going to put some more processors or bigger processors in a box, you want to do it before so that when you scan, it's there. And then, we're going to talk here in a couple of seconds, but you really want to review if you need SA upon expiration. And I think this is really key because I think most organizations just feel that they should renew their SA on Windows servers. It's one that they tend to upgrade a little bit more frequently, and they want to do that. But I think you really want to review that. If you're not going to renew SA, you can still get these grants, but you still have to provide inventory to Microsoft, but then you want them to document your additional core grants in writing, okay? You can keep your documentation of how many processors you had and kind of show them, because there's nothing that says you have to go to Microsoft to get that, but you definitely want to go to them and get it in writing so that it gets included in your licensing files. Okay, so that's kind of what I wanted to touch base on licensing grants. Now, I know this says SQL Server in here, just pretend that's Windows. But what I wanted to say is here's how you really want to start looking at your data. You want to get this out of the map toolkit. If you're using it, there's a couple of different reports. You want to get them formulated like this. And so what you want to do is line your servers up to analyze this based on, get your host, and what we have here is computer names, so think of these as VMs. This should be Windows Server and the various editions or versions, and then which edition is it, whether it's standard or data center, and obviously those are all virtual. And you'll see the key things right here, the number of processors and the number of physical cores, and then you can actually go through there and figure out, should I be optimizing my licenses? How do I do that? And this is the way that you would get that set up, because if you look here, host 1 makes sense to license with data center for unlimited virtualization based on the number of them that are on there. But if we look at host 2, it's only got 1 instance. So we could potentially use just a standard license there. We have to watch and see if there's any of that vMotion going on there that's going to break the 90-day rule. Okay, so same with host 3, even host 4 would probably make more sense to stack. And I did get a question to say, can you just assign a single Windows Server OS license to a guest VM and then it can move from host to host? And the answer to that is no, because what ends up happening is if you assign it to that guest, you can assign it to a guest, so to speak, but when it moves from host 1 to host 2, the 90-day rule kicks in. So unfortunately, they don't have that server mobility rule within Windows Server. SQL, you can definitely do that. Windows, they don't allow you, and that's why you kind of get stuck. And so that's where stacking comes in play, where, what you would do in that case, if we go back to that simple scenario where you have host 1, host 2, VM moves from host 1 to host 2, license goes with it, VM moves back to host 1, license can't go with it. So what you would do in that case is just apply 1 license to host 1 and 1 license to host 2, and then it can move and the license is there. So, you can accomplish these things, and that's one of the things that we do when we look at this deployment data. You can accomplish these things, and especially depending on what sort of licenses you have. If you have some older L only and things like that, or you have more licenses than you need, you can definitely optimize these things and minimize that risk, but there's no way to get around that 90-day rule, so to speak. Okay, and so what I wanted to really show you is we work with a company called Block 64 quite a bit to do inventory, and they sort of do what MAP does and then a bunch more, and we like to use them when we're doing, audit or inventory type work with our clients. And we kind of worked with them and went and looked at a data set of just shy of about 17,000 servers that we'd inventoried inside of our client base in the last little while. And so a couple of things that I think is very important to note, and what I've done is I've just kind of organized this from the number of instances of the different versions of Windows Server here. But one of the biggest things to note is that there are only, in this data set, 6% on Windows Server 2012, okay? And this is very, this is a sizable data set, but this is also very much what we see in our client base, that Windows Server 2012 is just starting to get deployed. There's not a lot of servers that are out there. There's a ton of 2008 still out there. But what this data really says at a high level is 94% of SA is just wasted because organizations are running their databases, not their databases, and we're talking Windows servers here, running their Windows servers for 8 years plus. And so the break-even point at 25% a year for SA is 4 years. And so there's strategies that you can, take once you have this data across your environment, and you can look at that and say, do I need SA? Where does it make sense to have SA? So can I strategically purchase SA or not? So this is sort of the type of work that we do in our clients. We look at this deployment profile for them and come up with, plans around what makes sense to have SA on, what doesn't. Even if we want to have SA on 100% of our servers, this is a great thing to throw at Microsoft and say there's no value in it and use that as a negotiation lever, obviously. But another, point of interest is there's 3,500 of these servers that are about 21% of them that are Windows 2003 that are coming off support. So I know a lot of our clients are looking at what they do there. But, that's a great example of in your own environment, when we were talking about grants, this would be where you want to take a look at. Take a look at these 2003 servers because they're probably riding on older hardware. Can you get the hardware in before your agreement expires? So that you get better grants and things like that. And so you really want to take a look at these sorts of things. One of the things that I didn't touch base on that I should have, and I apologize, is when does this come into effect for me? So when do I have to care about Windows 2016 server licensing, so the core-based licensing? And the answer to that is if you're on an enterprise agreement, when it expires. Right, so if you just signed one last month, you've got basically the next 3 years before this becomes an issue because all your true-ups will be processor-based because they're locked on that agreement. If you don't have an enterprise agreement, so again, that's when it expires. 3 years if I just signed one, if it's next year, 2 years. So some organizations may have 3 years to do this. Sometimes you may want to take a look at your Windows Server environment and figure out if it makes sense to do something off-cycle with your EA to cover these things for 3 years. So there's some things you can do there if it looks like it's going to cost you money when you make this change. If you're on Select or Open, if you're a smaller organization, this change comes into effect the day Microsoft launches 2016. Okay, so for those of you that have Windows in your EA, you could have up to 3 years. For those of you that aren't in EA or in a program like Select or Open, this will happen the day that, basically the month that Windows 2016 hits the price list, okay? So the next thing that we saw in this data, and this is where the vast majority, so, I'm not talking price increases. I'm not talking that Microsoft moved the price of Windows Server from $1,000 to $1,200. I'm just talking licensing changes here. So in this 16,000 or so, or 17,000 or so servers that we had, 2,600 of them required more licenses than what they gave in 2012. And this is where most organizations didn't go back and take a look at that. And that's fairly sizable. Anything that you see shaded in kind of the yellow or orangish color there, those ones required more than one license in a grant in 2012, which most organizations didn't go out and get those. And so basically what that equated to was a 20% price increase back then. Because if you look at this data set, like I said, this is, pretty relative to what we see out there in our client environments, 20% of the servers required more than one license in that grant. And so Microsoft, the great thing that they do is they say grants are grants, and we get to, you get free licenses. Well, they're free when they give them to you. They're not free when you have to renew your SA, because now all of a sudden I have to pay for 2 licenses instead of just 1. And so the grants are a price increase, and in 2012, without doing a price increase on the license cost, this change from server to processor represents a 20% price increase. And so when I talk about the change to cores, and this is a little bit more difficult because we got to look at the number of processors and all that sort of stuff, but what you'll see here is here's where these license increases get driven. Basically, about 4% of the processors, again, those ones shaded in kind of the orangish color, require more licenses, and that's about a 4% price increase. And so that's why when we say the core licenses really are marginal in terms of what the change in licenses cost, from a pure just look at your technology perspective, it's only about 4%. Where they may get you is in some of the changes in the rules around virtualization and what you can and can't do with those, and that's where you really got to dig into it, okay? And so, if we go back to 2012, our data suggests that the price increases, again, not including if they increased the price of the license, was 24%. When you factor in the fact that they did increase the price of the licenses, it's over 30%. And when I look at some individual clients, we have one client that's facing a 40% price increase based on these changes. So it can be significant to you, and so I suggest that you take a look at this sooner rather than later, regardless of when your renewal's up, to see what sort of strategies you want to put into place, okay? And so one of the things that we are offering, we have a special offer if you go to the link, method180.com/Windows Server offer. We are offering up a one-time $9,500 assessment where we'll go in and look at your licenses. If you go to the page, just put in your name, email, and phone number, and we'll book a call to see if that makes sense. And if you have a little bit tough time remembering Windows-Server-Offer, if you just go to the Method 180 website, and stop pulling up nicely for me right now, but if you just go there, I think we have a link right below the main bar. It's just click here and it'll go to the landing page. So if you are interested in having or talking to us about doing an assessment, go to the site and sign up, or just give us a call, and we'd be happy to talk and see if there's something that we can help you with. And then I also wrote a little book on audits that if you go to method180.com/audit-book, you can get a copy of that if you want. So, Sean, I know that there's another question. I think Bruce asked another one here, and I'll answer that. But if there's any other questions, I'll just answer Bruce, and then we'll go from there. So I think Bruce was asking for some examples of strategies if your EA is coming up for renewal in the fall of 2016. And so I think, Bruce, one of the key things that I would say there is preparing now for that is very important, because there are a number of tactics that you can use. And so a lot of it has to do with analyzing, what you're using, how you're using that, and where you're going and what you're going to do. So, if I take a look at the Windows Server example, for instance, if we go back to that data, and let's just, say this is relative to your number of the servers that you have, what you may end up wanting to do is take a look at these Windows servers and figuring out, does it even make sense to have software assurance on them all, and trying to figure out which ones need it and which ones don't, and looking at figuring out what your minimum requirements are for software assurance, okay? And so that becomes a little bit of an analysis of your data, taking a look at your usage, because what happens in EAs quite often is we see that organizations basically, if I trace back, and they've been on 3, 4, 5 of these now, start with 1, I can see the true-ups that they did that rolled into 2, the true-ups they did that rolled into 3, and just keep buying more and more and buying more of Microsoft's new bundles, like going from core cals to e-cals and things like that. And so you really want to analyze your usage, and you want to come up with what I call a minimum renewal. Now, I don't believe that any organization of size today cannot renew something because of the things that they're doing with those product use rights in SA. But what you really want to do is get to the point where you understand what your minimum software assurance requirements are, and get ahead of this with Microsoft. So they're going to come to you probably because you're in fall. If they don't come to you and ask you if you want to do an early renewal for their June year end, they're going to be coming to you in August because they basically take July off with proposals. If you're $1 million a year EA today, they're probably going to come with $1.5 million, $1.75 million. What you want to do is beat them to it. You want to go to them and say, look, we've done an analysis. We only need $300,000 worth of assay, and start your negotiations there and get them to work you up versus you working down. And so I think that's, if I talk real high level, that's what I would say. But, if you reach out, just either book a call through the website on the site or send me an email personally, and we can set up some time and just talk about some strategies in a little bit more depth that would make sense for you. Sean, were there any other questions? Or?
Hi, sorry about that, Mike. I just had to unmute myself. Yes, we do have a couple of questions. One question is, how does this work with AWS or other cloud providers?
Yeah, so that's where the cloud mobility software assurance benefit comes into play. And so basically I'm going to assume that you're moving, well, let me take this. There's kind of two different ways I can answer this one, and I'll try and answer both of them quickly here. So if I'm just putting workloads in AWS is probably already licensed, particularly for Windows servers. They max out on they have a different license model that they use, and they just kind of sell you minutes or something that you're using of a Windows server. So you can just buy those licenses through AWS. Now, what Microsoft has announced is this cloud mobility where you can move your own licenses into AWS's cloud. But there's a lot of restrictions on it, and it's new. We don't have a lot of details on it yet, but from what I'm reading, I think that the use cases for this is going to be very limited, and here's why. So basically what we're seeing is if I have a standard server, Windows standard server with SA, I can send that to Amazon or Azure or any other third-party hoster, and I can send the license up into their cloud. But I can't have it on my physical server anymore. So if you're looking at doing, load balancing or something with them in the cloud or DR or whatnot, you can't really make use of that because it's still going to be installed on my kind of local server. If I have a data center license, the data center license will allow me unlimited virtualization on my host, and it'll allow me to send 2 VMs into the cloud. So I can't send unlimited. So it'll limit it to 2 VMs. And so if you're going to do a lot of virtualization with Amazon, Amazon has unlimited virtualization options already, so you're going to be better off to stick with their licensing models. But that question's kind of pretty complicated, Sean, and so whoever asked it, if they want to reach out, I'm happy to talk specifics of what you're doing, but there's probably about 20 different scenarios in that could come from that question that we can talk details with. So.
Okay, great. Mike, I think through the course of the presentation today, we wound up taking a number of questions. I think that pretty much answers all of them. So I just really would like to thank you for a very enlightening presentation, Mike. And just to let everyone know that we, as I mentioned earlier, we have recorded this presentation, and we'll be sending you a copy in the next few days. We'll also include links within that to the offers that Mike alluded to, both for the audit book and also for the Windows Server assessment. But I'd like to thank everybody for the time this afternoon, and thank you, Mike, for a great presentation.
Thank you, everybody.